Welcome to This Week in Heresy, episode 30, Paganism, Race, and Responsibility, with our guest via Skype, Emily Carlin. Hey, Emily, welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, could you introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, my name is Emily Carlin. I am a solitary eclectic witch. I've been practicing for about, more than 15 years. We'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
I teach defensive magic and shadow magic, and I've been doing so for a while now. You can learn more about me at my website, shadowcrafting.com, and that's with a K.
Awesome. So one of the things we talked about when we were setting this up was the fact that you are a pagan of color, and there's been a lot of stuff on the internet, especially the pagan blogosphere, newsphere, and all that about being a pagan of color. And why don't we just start with your thoughts on that, and we can kind of go from there.
Okay. Well, it's kind of a odd sort of thing where I'm biracial. So I'm half Caucasian and half Hispanic, which means that when you look at me, you don't necessarily know that I'm ethnic. It kind of depends on how much sun I'm getting and whether or not I'm standing next to my mother or my father. So I have a really kind of odd perspective on it. There's been so much in the blogosphere, like you were saying, and on the internet in various places where people are getting really, because there's been so many race issues in society at large recently, naturally we have to start thinking about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong in the pagan community. And it's kind of overwhelming when you're 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, because it's difficult to read articles about race relations when literally one parent is on each side of the issue. And it's a very strange, kind of off-putting situation.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So how do you see, I guess, seeing it from both sides, where do you see the argument going? And what I mean by that is, do you think there's been useful discussion, or do you think it's mostly reactionary because of the events in Ferguson and New York?
It's really hard to say, because I think the main issue that is in a lot of the pagan community, because it is predominantly Caucasian, there's sort of an issue. It's that I think I'm very articulate today, as you can tell. There's the idea of kind of the white savior complex, where, we're going to be the good guys. We're not going to do these things, and we're going to be really equal. And I see a lot of that in the pagan community, because there is a strong tendency towards liberalism in most of the pagan community. And we all like to think well of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of pagans don't run into people of color in the pagan community often enough to actually examine their own attitudes. I mean, in the 5 or 6 groups that I've been in over the last decade or two, I've been the only person of color, and I barely count. So I'm not sure of all these folks that are, they're saying really positive things, and they're being really articulate, and they're being really open-minded, but I just have to wonder whether they've actually had to put their money where their mouths are. Just because there's not that many pagans of color, though we are getting more vocal.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, this year is the second year that there's been a Pagan of Color suite, or did they have one last year? I don't remember.
I'm pretty sure there was one last year.
Yeah.
But I don't recall the year before that, though.
Right. They definitely didn't have one the year before.
But yeah, they did last year.
But considering that PantheaCon is, 20 plus years old, and that it's only the last couple of years, that's...
Yeah.
Especially given the area that we're in, too. I mean, there's lots of, not just people of color, period, but, there's a lot of different traditions that are primarily people of color that are around here that just don't get represented at PantheaCon. Not very well, anyway. At least not in the last, with the last couple of years, maybe accepted.
Yeah, absolutely. And my primary experience right now is I'm part of the local Pagan Pride Day planning committee. Mm-hmm. And I'm the only person of color. And, this year I'm the ritual coordinator. And when I suggested that I'm going to try to actually get a voodoo priestess to come and do a ritual, there was a certain number of people were kind of taken aback because they've never met anyone that does voodoo. So they have that media stereotype of them. And it's like, okay, these are our people and we're stereotyping them within our own community. How are they ever going to get accepted by the larger community if we don't even understand them? And, obviously there's certain media implications about voodoo as a practice, but it is primarily ethnic based. Most voodoo practitioners are non-Caucasian. So there's definitely a racial element to it that I think most people don't think about. And so that's where I see it most clearly because that's what I'm experiencing day to day. Right.
And one of the things that's always really bugged me is that we haven't had representation of people of color, of other traditions that are considered part of the pagan umbrella. But unfortunately, everything in the quote unquote neo-pagan community gets really whitewashed.
Mm-hmm. It really does. No, it's a very strange thing. Like I remember I think it was last year. It was 2 years ago. 2 years ago at PantheaCon, I was at a ritual and the guy I happened to be sitting next to was Puerto Rican and I'm of Puerto Rican descent. And so we started talking about kind of being Hispanic in the pagan community. I'm a solitary eclectic witch, and most witches that I know, not all, but I'd say a good 95% are Caucasian. Right. So my ethnicity just washes out because I'm light-skinned. And unless you hear me talking about food or right after I've said something in Spanish, there's no way you would know. Mm-hmm. But we started talking about just kind of the fact that it gets ignored. If it's not really obvious, basically your ethnicity goes away. It's like you're not ethnic at all. And there's something a little bit disempowering about that, just because a huge part of your heritage kind of disappears and just gets blended into the background because what you're doing doesn't ever celebrate it. Not that everything has to be celebrated, but something as integral to your identity as your race, that's something that really shouldn't be pushed aside. It's odd.
So it sounds like it's kind of like, well, I guess being between two worlds. I mean, that sounds kind of cliche, but, you have feet in both worlds, but yet in a very important part of your world, it just, from what it sounds like, it's just not there or just overlooked or people kind of have blinders on.
Yeah, pretty much. and it's not something that I think about all the time just because of I happen to be raised in a primarily Caucasian community, was raised very, very American. And so unless I'm specifically with my mother's family, I don't think about it in my day-to-day life. But it's when you look at kind of most pagan practices, particularly if you look at things like Wicca or Druidry or Asatru, there's a lot of Western European, which is fine.
Right.
But it's almost, if you go to your traditional kind of witchcraft-based ritual, it's going to be very British, culturally speaking, unless the group you're in is specifically about integrating cultures. You're going to be immersed in British colonial culture.
Right.
And as an ethnic person, that's a little weird sometimes. Like, it doesn't make me feel bad, but it does occasionally feel like I don't belong there. I'm not British. I'm not Irish. I'm not German. There's not a drop of white Northern Western European in my body. And yet these traditions that that are deeply beloved and that are a huge part of my identity and a huge part of my religious practice day to day is about this other culture that I've seen on television, and I've been to these places and know lots of people that are of that heritage. But to find something that is celebrating my heritage, there's just not as much of it, and they don't necessarily overlap. You've got things like Santa Muerte, which is a Mexican saint who is becoming a huge figure in magic practice. You've got Candelerismo, you've got curanderos, and they don't come to Pantheacon. I have never met a curandero at Pantheacon because they stay in the barrio. They're not coming. They don't feel welcome. That's a problem.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest problems in the neo-pagan movement, whatever you want to call it, is that it's very white, middle class, and also I'd say cisgender, et cetera, et cetera.
Certainly in the traditional things, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know my coven is trying really hard to be much more inclusive, but we're also honest with ourselves. We are very white and middle class, and we don't look like the way we want to represent people, if that makes any sense to you.
No, it totally does. The pagan community, particularly the active public pagan community, is very self-selecting. It's got to be people who have the time, the vacation days, people who aren't so busy, and people whose communities would not ostracize them or are willing to take those kinds of risks, because it is still a risk in a lot of places. And there's language barriers.
Right.
Like I was doing some research on Santa Muerte, and I have the benefit that I can actually read Spanish. So I have access to those materials. Well, if you don't speak Spanish, it can be... I don't have a lot of faith in other people's translations of that stuff, basically. And I have the luxury of being able to read both. But if I couldn't, I don't know that I would trust the information that I could get my hands on. So until we have people who are part of both groups moving back and forth, it's just harder to see them integrated. Like, Pantheacon does have some pretty impressive Vodun practitioners. But most of them are white.
Right.
they absolutely know what they're doing. They're absolutely amazing, powerful people, but they're not bringing the Haitians because they can't afford to get to San Jose. So even when we have these more ethnic traditions, the people that can get to Pecan are still largely middle-class Caucasian.
Right.
But I mean, how do we actually address that, though? How do we change that? If we need whomever is going to be at our events and participating in our community to have a certain amount of leisure time, and I mean, there's nothing we can really do about that except make ourselves as available and open as possible so the people where it's a bigger risk, more trouble, can be more confident that they're going to enjoy themselves when they get there. And,
not be kind of looked at funny, or at the very least for what they believe, because, there's a good deal of these traditions that mix Christianity and magical elements.
Absolutely.
And even myself, I'm a Wiccan Christian, and I get crap from other pagans about mixing Wicca and Christianity. And so I can understand to a degree why some of these traditions wouldn't feel welcome at some place like Pantheacon, because there is a very heavy anti-Christian bias there.
There absolutely is. I mean, as someone who grew up so mixed their entire lives, eclecticism kind of comes naturally to me.
Right.
Because I've never been one or the other of anything I've ever done. I've always mixed things. Mm-hmm. My Thanksgiving table had a turkey, pasteles, and matzo ball soup. I kid you not.
Yum.
We eat amazingly well.
Awesome.
Every continent gets represented at our family Thanksgiving. It's amazing.
Awesome.
But it means that not mixing things doesn't make any sense to me. But I've never been in a situation where you didn't mix things. And I can't put myself in that mindset any more than they can put them in mine. Mm-hmm. So there's no easy solution. I mean, it's all about sharing information and opening a dialogue and seeing what happens, because that's all we can do.
True. And how do you think that dialogue should go? Because there's some people that I've talked to, and they're very, I guess one way to put it is militant. And and I totally understand where that comes from. And it's needed, and I understand it. However, sometimes, at least in my opinion, I feel that militancy can drive some people who would want to be allies away.
Absolutely. I mean, there's kind of the age-old thing of, how do we preserve our heritage while embracing other people's, without diluting our stuff. I can understand that mindset. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I can understand it and I respect it. I mean, amongst other things, I'm a trained mediator. Mm-hmm. I'm an attorney. And that absolutely colors the way all of my public interactions go. And I always approach things as a mediator. I'm always trying to find common ground. And common ground is actually shockingly easy to find if you're willing to identify it. Most people, when they're coming to a situation, if they're uncomfortable, they don't know what's going to happen, they come, wrapped in their own preconceptions and armored against whatever might happen to them.
Right.
It's very difficult to get to the truth if you're under 6 layers of armor.
Absolutely.
The same way, if you're an empath under, a foot of concrete shield, you're not going to be a great healer because you can't ever feel the other person's energy. Same mm-hmm. way, you can't open up a dialogue if you're just worried about protecting your own stuff. You have to come to the table willing to hear what the other people have to say. You don't have to sacrifice what you believe. You don't have to change what you believe. You just have to be willing to hear them out. a lot of people kind of mistake hearing something and empathizing with it with buying into that and making that your viewpoint.
Right.
I grew up in a small town called Edmonds, which is pretty much white, upper middle class. I then did a bunch of advanced education where I hung around a lot of upper middle class, highly educated people. There are certain viewpoints I am never going to understand just because I've never experienced it. I'm very, very fortunate in my life. And so when you have these other viewpoints that are so different, it's very difficult to take off your own hats, actually open your mind, because you can't see your own biases. If you could, they wouldn't be biases anymore. Mm-hmm. And we all have them. So I think any dialogue between ethnic groups, between gender groups, has to start with being willing to absolutely hear what the other people have to say and accepting that you can hear them and understand them, and that doesn't actually diminish you. Because a lot of people are afraid of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like in some circles where some people think that if they go to see somebody else's religion, then it's going to somehow diminish their own faith in their own religion. And I'm sitting there like, actually, it could make your faith stronger. It doesn't necessarily mean, just because you see somebody else's faith or ideas or even ethnicity, it doesn't mean it's going to make yours any less.
Yeah.
But being open to the new ideas could enrich your life.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, just because of my background, I find those points of view very difficult to understand. And it's fear. It's all fear-based.
Yeah.
We fear what we don't understand because we can't predict what it's going to do. We can't control it.
Right.
But most of that control is an illusion anyway. We stick to what we know because it's comfortable. Well, I don't know about other people's practices of various pagan faiths, but I know my faith is not based on being comfortable. Mm-hmm. The major appeal for me, at least, of the various pagan faiths is that they're very naturalistic. It's very raw. You go and you experience things, and you can't control what that experience is going to be for you. You go into a circle, you contact the divine. You can't control what the divine is going to tell you. If you're doing things right, you could have your world rocked every ritual. How can someone who embraces that be afraid of talking to someone from a different tradition or a different race or a different socioeconomic status? That's insane.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So,
well, it's like, okay, you're perfectly happy talking to all these deities of different traditions, mm-hmm. because many of the pagans I know don't just talk to the Celtic ones.
Yeah.
And it's like, so okay, you're willing to talk to Kali, but the pagan of color and the pagan of color suite, you're not willing to go and sit and listen to them? Excuse me?
Yeah. No, if you're willing to go talk to Shango and Isis and Caradwyn, you should be willing to talk to lots of different people.
Right?
Because if you're doing your religion right, there is a risk factor in that. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. It kind of baffles me. But that's me.
Well, it baffles me too, because, I want to make sure that I know the history of the deities that come and knock on my door, And
yeah.
Lately, I've had a lot of like knocks on the door from some of the Orisha and deities on that side of the street. And I'm like, I need to know more about that. I should go ask the people I know who are in that.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. I go to an African American church on Sundays with a bunch of people who practice that. I should ask them.
Yes. I had an experience. I was in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Oh, wow.
And it was during law school. I was doing a thing on international humanitarian law, which is really insane. But one of the gals in our class was a Indian. Apparently, I did not know this before going there, but South Africa is like 30% Indian.
Right.
And so I got to know this gal, and it came up because I wear a pentagram ring. She's like, "Oh, what's that?" I'm like, "Oh, that means I'm a witch." She's like, "I do not think you use that word to mean what I think it means. So tell me what you think that means." And I was very proud of her for asking that question, because if you say you're a witch in Africa, you're saying something very different than if you're saying that in America. Let me tell you, people are still burned as witches in a large parts of Africa.
Yeah.
It's a very different world. But we started talking about kind of, what paganism is, what Wicca is, what witchcraft is. And I mentioned that a lot of pagans work with Hindu deities. Mm-hmm. And she was freaked out by that.
Really?
Like she couldn't actually conceive, but how can you work with Hindu deities if you're not a Hindu? I'm like, well, a lot of pagans are really, really polytheist. Like every pantheon they've ever heard of, polytheist.
Right.
And this was a completely foreign concept to her. There's not a lot of Wiccans in South Africa. And even fewer witches. It's a whole thing. But, in a place like South Africa, race is a totally different conversation. They're still dealing with the vestiges of apartheid.
Right.
It is a different world. But, most people don't ever, most people in the United States, at least, don't ever experience race like that.
Yeah.
It's unavoidable part of everyday life for everybody there. Mm-hmm. It's just a completely different conversation. So,
well, yeah, that makes sense, because my wife has said a lot of the same things. My wife is from the UK, and she talks about how race in the US is a very strange and different conversation than other parts of the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the United States is kind of enormous.
Right.
So you can live your entire life in a small town and never actually see people of color. Mm-hmm. That's not possible in a lot of other places in the world. Yeah. Obviously, I'm not saying that race isn't an issue elsewhere. It obviously is. But yeah, the race conversation in the United States is ridiculous in pretty much every possible way.
Right.
But then again, I have a very particular viewpoint, and other viewpoints that are, things that I consider to be insane. Other people truly believe those things. I think it's insane, but I can't put myself in their shoes. I can't.
Right.
I can't do it any more than they can put themselves in mine.
Right.
So, I don't know.
Well, that's one of the things I always talk about with people, is that, I can never have an understanding about what oppression is like, from learning the stories and talking to people. But, there are certain things I will never, ever truly understand fully, because I'm not in that target group. So, like I talk about that with my wife all the time because I am not transgender. I will never fully understand what it means to be a transgendered person. I can have an understanding because of the stories of my wife and friends and all. So, I think it's a really hard concept for people to really grok. Like, they want to help so much that they can say, oh, I understand that. And it's like, no, you can't, not entirely.
Yeah. And I think for me, that's the biggest problem with the race conversation in the pagan community. People desperately, desperately want to be a part of it, but they don't actually have anything to say. When Ferguson happened, every major pagan figure said something about it.
Right.
And they pretty much all said the same damn thing.
Yeah.
Because they, with a few notable exceptions, they were all white.
Right.
And you can absolutely be an ally and you can absolutely do amazing things. But unless your life actually involves interacting with ethnic people, you're not really part of that conversation beyond examining your own prejudices and point of view.
Right.
And, I do not interact with other people of color in the pagan community unless I'm deliberately looking for it. And even then, it's hard.
Yeah. Well, so few and far between.
Yeah.
Even I know that.
Yeah. So I don't know that there's much we can actually, as the individual people in the pagan community, there's not a whole lot you can do in terms of making kind of the conversation about race better. Because for most people, there is no conversation about race because there's only one race.
Yeah.
For most of them.
Right.
So, we are all citizens of the world. We are all human beings. And so it is important that we talk about these things and we think about our own point of view, but there's not that much to talk about specifically within the pagan community unless you're talking about getting a group from the pagan community to go out into the larger community to do something. If your coven's going to go attend a protest,
right,
that is how the pagan community can look at race for the most part, where it doesn't have to be, if there's no people of color for you to interact with and talk to about this stuff, or if it's just not an issue, you have to go out into your larger community and then represent the rest of the pagan community that way. Right. That's how you can make positive change as a Caucasian pagan in terms of race, is to leave your little isolated area and go out and be a part of a larger thing.
Well, I was just going to bring that up because, a lot of pagan groups are extremely insular. It's their little pagan group and their little pagan world, and maybe they'll help the greater pagan community, but oh my God, let's not think about the rest of the world.
Yeah. I live in Seattle. We are not, as a city, unless it involves the Seahawks, we are not open and friendly and welcoming. There's something called the Seattle freeze.
Right.
Basically, Seattle is a very gloomy place where you put your collar up and put your hat down and you huddle against the wall against the rain, and you don't talk to other people.
Right.
We don't do this in the society at large. We do it even less in the pagan community. The Seattle pagan community is appalling. In fact, for community, I have to go to Tacoma, which is this next city south, because they're actually nice there.
Oh, my.
I love the pagans that are in Seattle, but we don't tend to talk to one another very often. So the idea of getting your little local group to go out and do something to manifest your will in the world at large takes a lot of deliberate effort and a fair amount of courage. Because a lot of people in the pagan community, we have the problem where a lot of people are in the broom closet.
Yep.
A lot of people can't, be open in their day-to-day lives. So if you're hiding your religion, you can't represent your religion to the rest of the community around you. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
So how can we address these difficult concepts if half the people, the only time they're ever open about it is when they're at something like Pecan?
Mm-hmm.
Everything we do has this tradition of secrecy. I mean, look at alchemy. They still hide their formulas in their own books by omitting large paragraphs.
Right.
All of these pagan traditions, all of the magical traditions, all these occult traditions are all based in a history of secrecy. We don't talk.
Yeah.
To will, to dare, to be silent is part of the basic tenets of a lot of Western paganism. Well, that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we even think so. I mean, our coven is very deliberately non-secretive. We don't, we feel like most of the stuff that is quote unquote secret, it's something you can probably Google in about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, even the Masons can't hide their rituals anymore, I mean, exactly. You can find the Masonic rituals, the Easter Star rituals. You can find all those secret societal rituals somewhere online.
If a 14-year-old can hack the DOD, your coven secrets are not safe.
Right. Absolutely.
No, secrecy is stupid.
Yeah. Well, also to quote my my bishop, one of the things she says is that secrets kill. And, generally she's talking about, the secrets that you have inside that you need to let out in the open so that you can heal. But I also think that rings true for the secrecy stuff that happens in the pagan community.
Absolutely.
And because, we're kind of killing our own movement by being all secretive. And keeping the secrets isn't really viable these days.
Well, and it promotes misinformation in the larger community.
Yeah.
I would way rather answer someone's question openly and directly and have them learn the truth from me than have them Google it, get what some scare tactics person looking for a cult following says, and making the rest of us look bad.
Yeah, no kidding.
Secrecy, if you're not open and transparent in the information age, you obviously have something to hide.
Right.
I mean, this is the changing face of our world as we march through, the next century. If you're not willing to let people know what's going on, they're going to make up a story, and that's what everyone's going to learn about you.
Right. Exactly.
And so I think until we have a lot more openness, and it is getting better. It's getting so much, but even looking at from when I first started to now, there is so much more information that is actually good, viable information available than there used to be. Learning to have that openness will completely change the way our community interacts inside of itself and with the larger community outside of us.
Right.
So,
well, I think it's already starting to change it already because, we're starting to get more into theological discussions than, instead of like, I was discussing, I think it was with Devin Hunter quite a few interviews back. We were discussing how there's a more tend towards talking about theology and like what is polytheism, what is Wicca, what is Wiccan privilege, and all that. Instead of, even like 10 years ago, the conversation was like more of pagan rites, And so I think I think you're right. I think it's opening it up. But I think we're also learning in the process that we're not really much different from any other religion.
Imagine that. People are people regardless of their faith.
Oh my goodness. Oh my.
No, I know. I came into the pagan world when I got to college. I was out of my parents' house. I was allowed to get books delivered to my door that my parents would not see.
Right.
And therefore, that's when I began exploring. And that is true for a lot of people, particularly of, my generation.
Right.
I'm 33.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the people I would say that I meet in the pagan community that are my age came into it when they were late teens, early 20s. That's pretty normal. But that means that a huge portion of the pagan community is really young, new at it, and excited about it.
Right.
And oftentimes rebelling against their previous faith.
Right.
And you can't have an open, honest dialogue about your faith unless you're really confident in it. If you've only been practicing for 2 years, you're probably not really confident in it. The pagan community is growing up.
Yeah.
And we have more people who have been doing it longer. And we do have, an amazing wealth of elders
Mm-hmm.
that we didn't used to have just by virtue of not being around that long. And I think as we grow up as a community and kind of come out of puberty into true adulthood, I think the conversation is going to change a lot, because it's going to be less of, well, I have to figure out what I'm doing. And it's going to be a lot more of, I know what I'm doing. I need to figure out how that fits into the world.
Right.
So basically, I agree with what we were saying.
Yeah. Well, it's really fascinating to watch that there's a lot of really younger kids, of the younger generations
Mm-hmm.
that are actually growing up in open pagan households.
Yeah.
And that's really fascinating, because a lot of the arguments that the elders are having, they're kind of like, why are you arguing about this?
Yes, absolutely. Like, I mean, I'm in my early 30s. I don't consider myself to be that young.
Mm-hmm.
But in the pagan community, in terms of like the elders, I am relatively young. So there's this weird, like, the difference between the conversation you have in a leadership workshop at Pantheacon, where it's women who've been running covens for 30 years, versus the conversation you have on Tumblr
Right.
with the 16-year-old who goes, oh my God, this one has rhinestones on it. It's amazing.
Right.
They're very different conversations.
Right.
And the issues that, kids who grew up with cell phones have different issues than I have and people my age have. And certainly very different than people of generation before mine.
Mm-hmm.
The differences are enormous. And particularly when you look at things like issues of race and gender.
Right.
I find the point of view between someone who is in their 50s versus in their 20s is so different. I can barely tell they're having the same conversation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we saw that when we did the gender work with our coven. It's just like, the younger people are like, hey, transgender people are cool. What are we arguing about? And the older people are like, wah.
Yeah. The things that the younger generation just doesn't give a shit.
Yeah.
They don't care. They don't care at all. It means nothing to them. And like the idea of secrecy.
Yeah.
If you grew up with the internet, secrecy doesn't even exist. It's not part of your vocabulary.
Yeah.
You tweet your entire life.
Yeah.
Of course you're going to be open and answer things, because nothing is secret.
Yeah. And
it's a non-issue.
Right. And you assume that, if it's on the internet, it's never been a secret.
Exactly. It's just such a completely different worldview. Like, it's a non-compatible paradigm shift.
Right.
It's just interesting to see, as we have the newer folks, the younger generations, as those older generations are actually starting to age out of leadership positions into elderhood. I think the pagan community is going to change pretty dramatically.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I think we're kind of in an in-between time.
Yeah, we're in that awkward pubescent stage where nothing quite fits.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like society as a whole is in that as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, we could see kind of the microcosm of that in the pagan community itself, I think.
I think in general, the pagan community has actually got a pretty good kind of ability to adapt because we are, you know, I'd say 80% converts.
Right.
We are folks who are used to changing our minds.
Right.
Most of us had to change our mind about a dearly held belief to come into our faith.
Mm-hmm.
It makes change a little bit less scary, I hope. So hopefully we'll be maybe a little bit more flexible, a little bit better at adapting to these changes as they come than society at large.
I hope so. I mean, I like to think so. I mean, most of the people that I know are pretty adaptable and are pretty okay with the evolution of traditions. Although there are some people that are like, I don't want to change my way I practice because of XYZ that you brought up. And it's like, okay, I'm not telling you that you have to, but, you know, could you at least listen a little bit? You know?
Yeah. Well, and, you know, like what I was saying earlier, you can listen to what other people are saying and understand their practices without changing your personal practices.
Right.
You know, if you're going to be doing public ritual, you know, for the larger community, then yeah, you might need to change some of the stuff you're doing to be more inclusive. But what you're doing at home, that's your faith, that's your sacred, that's your thing. You do whatever you need to do.
Right. Get on with your bad self.
Yeah. Whatever you need to do. I'm not even going to ask. But if you're going to be, you know, presenting to the community at large, you do have to kind of be willing to accept the mores of the community at large. I mean, it's the social contract. If you want to talk to other people, you have to not be evil to them.
Right.
Most of us should accept this.
Yeah.
And if that means being a little uncomfortable and bending and flexing the way you do things a little bit, you know, that might be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, you know, if you're going to say that you are a priest or priestess, however you want to define yourself and define those words,
mm-hmm.
you know, you've committed yourself, you put the shingle out there to the universe that you are acting in that capacity. And if you are doing public work as a priest or priestess, you know, you have to be mindful of the people that are going to come to you.
Yeah.
And come to your events.
Well, that kind of brings up the question of, if someone is a priest or priestess, what is your duty? Are you serving the gods and your community? Are you just serving the gods and happen to be serving your gods in your community? Most people, I think, would say that a priest or priestess is serving their deity and their community equally. That's kind of what priestessing and priesting is, at least my understanding of it.
Yeah.
So if you've made that choice to serve your community, you have to respond to the needs of that community.
Right.
And so if your community has a need, you've got to figure out what you need to do that is in accord with your gods that serves that need.
Mm-hmm.
And I think finding the balance there might be a large part of what the discussion really should be. If, you know, I am a shadow witch, I practice very weird, dark, Jungian psychological stuff. That's my personal practice.
Right.
That doesn't mean that when I offer a public ritual as part of Pagan Pride Day, that we're going to be doing shadow work.
Right.
Because that's not what serves the community at large.
No.
It is the major part of my practice. You will not see it in my public ritual.
Right.
Because it's just not appropriate.
Right. I mean, there's also transparency too. You know, if you're offering a particular type of ritual that has, say, some limitations Or, like you're saying, it's going to do some dark, funky stuff. If you're opening
you gotta
up,
warn people.
Right. Label it correctly on the tin, as my wife would say.
Yeah. No, anyone who has ever been to public ritual has had good experiences and bad experiences. I once went to a public ritual where everyone, including the woman with the cane, was required to participate in a spiral dance.
Oh, no.
And required to hug every person in the room.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I left mid-ritual.
Yeah.
And this was a public Sabbat held in a community room at a library. This wasn't like on private land of a particular tradition.
Wow.
It's like, talk about not serving your community. You would make someone who is physically impaired risk injury? You are not serving your community.
Well, that's a lack of responsibility and realizing and doing your homework about who's in your community and who you're serving and making sure that you have ways for people to interact that are not necessarily exactly the way you envision it.
Yeah. But that kind of short-sightedness is not that uncommon. It's rarely that blatant.
Right.
I mean, nobody's going to say, yes, you should make the person with the broken leg dance. Unless you're a complete idiot.
Yeah.
Because injury gets sued.
Right?
You injure someone, you get sued. This is America.
Yeah.
But that extends so much deeper than most people realize. It extends to, if there is one ethnic person in the room, you've got to make sure that person is not thinking in their head, oh my God, I am the only ethnic person in the room. They need to be having an experience the same as everybody else.
Right.
If you have someone, the issue of gender is huge. Mm-hmm. If you have someone that is of a non-binary gender and you're invoking only binary deities and, like sectioning off the room into binary groups, that person is being invalidated.
Right.
You can't do that ethically, in my opinion. So people just have to think a little bit more. I mean, I have to admit, because I grew up in a way where non-binary gender was not a concept I grew up with. Mm-hmm. I had to learn that as an adult. It just happens to be the way things were.
Yeah, yeah.
But that is a huge part of society now, and that's something that if we want to be a positive force in our communities, we need to respond to that.
Yeah.
And we need to treat all people like people. Yeah. Regardless of whatever labels they have that they've put on themselves, that society's put on them, whatever. People are people.
Yeah.
And you've got to make sure that your people are treated well.
Well, that kind of dovetails a little bit into, a lot, I think, arguments about cultural appropriation and what it is.
Yeah.
Because, the way I always see it and the way I've described it to other people is that, if you are using something that is not of your own ethnic background, say, if you are responsible and you're learning and you've learned about it, you've learned the history, you've learned the good and the bad history, and then you're open about that. Mm-hmm. Then, is it using another tradition's technique or is it cultural appropriation? And that's been a huge argument.
Yeah.
Oh, it's been really bad. Yeah. In some areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as an eclectic, I beg, borrow, and steal from everyone.
Yeah, we do too.
Everyone. I found that certain traditions, their deities like me. Certain other traditions, their deities don't like me so much.
Right.
Yeah, I cannot work with North American natives, American spirits in any way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. Central American, no problem. North American, they do not like me.
Yeah.
At all. Most Norse deities don't like me all that much. Celtic,
Right.
no problem. Greek, no problem. It's a thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I agree that as long as you are respectful of whatever tradition, practice, deity you're working with, I think that's fine. You know, there are obviously certain practices and certain deities that are absolutely part of a culture, you know, like, God, is the Native American ceremony with the hook poles, the Sundance?
Oh, right, right.
That is not something, because that is so culturally specific. That is probably not a technique I would consider using.
Right.
You know, it just that's going too far in my where that line is drawn. I could not tell you, but that one in particular, I think might be best left to the shaman.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then you have other, you know, I work with Santa Muerte.
Mm-hmm.
She is a very new figure. She's very, very flexible. She is pretty much okay with being appropriated and bent into different shapes because she's still developing.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody can work with her. She's cool with it. As long as you're not stupid about it.
Right.
You know? So I think the issue of cultural appropriation, I think absolutely what you said, how you do it is absolutely paramount. But then the nature of each individual practice really, you know, if you are, most pagan faiths have an element of intuition
Mm-hmm.
and personal gnosis.
Right.
If you're looking at a practice and you feel that pull, like you're supposed to do it, you're supposed to contact that deity, you're supposed to do that right, chances are you're probably supposed to experience that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at a particular tradition, a particular practice, particular deity, and something just says, you know, back off.
Yeah.
You know, if you're going to try something that belongs to somebody else, acknowledge that it belongs to somebody else, be respectful. But there's no copyright on a religious practice.
Right.
It's so dependent on the individual execution. You know, when I see people putting a smudge stick in an abalone shell, I cringe every single time. Because in most of the traditions that use sage smudge, the abalone is a water and the sage is fire, and the twain should never meet.
Right.
That's a new age practice that happened in the 70s because abalone shells are pretty.
Right.
But now a huge portion of the pagan community has been doing it for 40 years. Does that suddenly legitimize it because we've been doing it for 40 years? Is it no longer appropriating this other cultural practice? Is now our thing? You know, I don't have an answer to that. But I think cultural appropriation is so difficult because, you know, as an American, we've culturally appropriated everything.
Right.
We are cultural appropriation as a culture.
Right.
I mean, that's what the melting pot is. You know, you're going to have a different opinion from a practitioner in the United States than you are in Europe, because most of them are far more adherent to strict traditions because they can be, because they've had them. Most of us out here in the States have had to build things. So we beg, borrow, and steal where we can.
Exactly.
I think to say that you can't have cultural appropriation in pagan circles kind of misses the point, where pagan faiths are about being more integrated into the world around us, into nature, into listening to our own energies. You know, there's a line, of course, but for the most part, what we do is based on what feels right. And if it feels right to me to do whatever, who are you to say I'm not allowed to do that because it came from somewhere else first? As long as I'm not being a dick about it.
Right. Exactly.
So.
Well, on that note, we are out of time. So I know you're going to be presenting at PantheaCon. So if you could let people know when your workshop and what it is will be.
I am presenting Pop Culture Magic, Working with Villains, Friday night at 9. I think I'm in San Martin, San Simeon. And it's all going to be about how to work with your favorite pop culture villains in your magical practice.
Ooh, interesting.
I'm a huge geek, so I like the geeky practices.
Fabulous. And if people would like to get in touch with you to ask you questions, where could they go?
The easiest way is just to email me, and it's real easy because it's emily@e-carlin.com.
Excellent. And so are there any websites you would like to send them to, or just shoot an email?
I've got 2 different websites. My personal site is just www.e-carlin.com. And then I also have Shadow Crafting. That's Shadow Crafting with a K and not a C.com. And that is where I do my teaching online, where I teach defensive magic and shadow magic.
Excellent. Well, we'll put all that in the show notes and your workshop as well. And thank you so much for coming on and being on the show.
Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
I'd like to thank Emily for joining us this week. As always, if you have comments, questions, or would like to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com. You can support This Week in Heresy by subscribing to the show via iTunes or the Stitcher app, following us on Twitter at TWIH Podcast, or financially through Patreon. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.